I've talked about this at times in my life, of videoing and whatnot, thrown in here and there. Sorry about my hand there. I actually just pinched it. So, which is that to some extent I have animistic beliefs. Now, and they kind of tie into a lot of things. The book I'm reading right now delves into faith to some extent in certain ways. We'll get to that when we get to the book. I'm about halfway done now in one day. Yeah, I don't know. Like, when I was young, my parents were both raised Roman Catholic. My mother, was taught by nuns for at least a few years. I don't really know my father's, whether he went to a Catholic school or not. But by the time I was around and whatnot, I would say that they were kind of firmly agnostic. My mom had this strong antipathy towards the whole religious towards the whole upbringing that she had, and being, slammed through a glass cabinet by a nun and hit and all that kind of shit that everybody who went to religious school in those days probably went through. And it feels more like there was sort of there's probably a God out there, but it's not really like, what we were taught about in our religions kind of feeling. My father was always, we had a couple of discussions about this, always kind of bought into the Pascal's wager kind of thing of, well, if there is a God and I'm damned to hell if I don't believe in him, I ought to at least sort of believe in him because, I wouldn't want to take my chances. But honestly, there are so many different religions and belief systems that encompass, the whole of humanity over time. And then even in modern time, why would you pick in particular the Christian view, and much, much worse than that, one particular sect of Christianity or whatever? Why pick that over some other belief system? Is it just because it's kind of the only one that says, well, that says you're damned if you don't believe? That seems a little weird. Now, my reaction was always of the sort of, this God that is put forth in the Judeo-Christian Islamic system is one evil motherfucker. And by the time I was like 12 or 13 or so, my thought was, this is something I oppose directly and completely. Like, the God of the Old Testament and all of its antecedents is, that would be descendants, not antecedents, is just this terrible thing that is almost inherently in opposition to what feels right to me. Which isn't, that I should go out and murder and rape or anything like that. No, rather it's, the idea of an omnipotent, omniscient God, knowing that Adam and Eve are going to eat from the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil and damn themselves forever and all of humanity, and still making that the rule, I mean, there's no free will there anymore, man. If things are predestined, you know about them, and you set up all the conditions and all the rules, and you created these things the way that they are, and that's not free will. That's programming. And you're trying specifically to create a misery situation, and so many other things. And the answer is always, oh, God works in mysterious ways. Fuck that, man. No. And a bunch of the stuff in the Old Testament is just so ugly and so evil. But I also don't find the New Testament particularly enlightening and thrilling in terms of like giving me any hope of anything. It is once again this evil, malicious creature, just represented in another way, Now, I'm much, much less conversant about Islam, like almost not at all. So I can't really speak to that. But again, what I see of what Islam did in the world, for the most part through history, doesn't particularly impress me. So I'm not that interested in as a path. Some of the Gnostic beliefs do kind of entice me, especially what was represented as Catharism. All things are light. The material world is unimportant, and it is essentially the hell that we have to pass through. And by perfecting ourselves within this, we make ourselves clean enough to be in another world. That's somewhat more pleasing, but I still know that it's based on that Old Testament principle, and that makes it unpalatable. But there was a certain time in my life where I felt myself nearly a Cathar, or at least what's represented as Cathars. Yeah, the funny thing is, the term was not used by the people who suffered the Albigensian Crusade particularly. It was used against them, and it was a term that was anachronistic at the time, leading back to another era. But that other era, that earlier Christianity from, I guess, around 4th, 5th century AD, was, certainly has to be, because you couldn't really have Christianity in the BC. But the ideas behind it are somewhat appealing, but not terribly so. I think it really had to do with the dualism of the Persian system being kind of incorporated in, and eventually being a heresy and whatnot. And somehow the word Cathar got attached, and then people started taking the purity of the church movement. This is the current thinking, as far as I know, that the purity of the church movement got kind of linked back to that Cathar or Cathartic beliefs, and and then Bulgar was also absolutely like, it's just because the term Cathars had been used for people in Bulgarian heresies a little earlier, and it was seen that it moved, and it really, there's no evidence for any of this. Really, what there is church arguments that this is what happened, but it doesn't appear to be any real evidence for it. Anyway, but that was, not just to me, but to a lot of people who looked into how Catharism was being presented, was kind of appealing and everything. But at some point, I would say in my late 20s probably, I was searching for, now I can't really say, like, nothing was formalized before then in what I kind of believe, but I did believe very much in being able to take, like, spirit from the ground and from the wind and from the water and and fire was always so attractive to me, although I've never mastered it. Um, but it was very appealing. And I always had a mystical bent to me in the sense that, I believed that if I did certain things, such as the 2 week fast, which I had not, I had attempted, but I had never succeeded in back that before, my late 20s or whatever. Um, that like, that would be a transition point, you know, because I had read somewhere that that's what makes you a magus at the first rank, right? But also in my teens, I believed that I could kind of transition worlds because I saw glimpses of things, not in terms of visions or anything, but I could kind of put my mind state into something where my imagination worked very well, and I read stories about people transiting into other universes and all that. And that was sort of the focus of where I was in my later teens as I started to develop some kind of mystical basis, right? Now, that mystical basis went to things like, fighting demons and all kind of shit like that. But I knew that these things weren't, my rational reality, more the product of an imagination that wanted that kind of magical world. But anyhow, sometime in my late 20s, maybe earlier than that, yeah, it had to be early 20s, I started working on a role-playing game, right? In terms of just making my own role-playing game. Yeah, this had to be around 20, actually. But at some point or another, I started developing the magic system for it. And what I wanted in the magic system was an underlying theory and basis to all magic. If I was going to have magic possible in the world, I wanted some way, not just to explain how magic worked, but to make a scientific reality out of it. And what I kind of decided on throughout that was that magic was based on the idea, like, if you want to levitate an object, you have to convince the object to not obey the rules of physics, essentially, is how I looked at it. And, I was familiar with things like RuneQuest, which had spirits everywhere and everything, and had my, comparative religions and whatnot in my head. And what I kind of came across was that made sense. That every object had its own spirit, that it could be convinced and everything. And again, I didn't believe in this at that point, and I'm not sure how much I believe in it now. I like it. It is kind of what it is. It's more aesthetically appealing than other beliefs that I've seen. And that, trumps certainly the kind of evils, and it trumps this sort of anthropomorphic gods of, of the early Indo-Europeans and on, through the pagan period and whatnot. That, what are they, metaphors for how humans feel? Is Aphrodite just like the feeling of desire? Is Zeus the paternity? Is it just sort of code for how things are? Or are these really supposed to be people living on Mount Olympus who are just super powerful, like superhero type characters, which the latter seems absolutely laughable, even that like a simplistic, more primitive people would believe that, right? These are modern humans in terms of their intellectual and emotional capabilities. It feels really unlikely that anyone except whack jobs believes in, these physical manifestations of gods, or for that matter, the byproduct of a very similar type of religion that occurred in Canaan and in the Near East, and eventually somehow got funneled into there's one God and the other things are either angels or devils, and the ones that really had to be suppressed are evil. But yet, had some kind of semi-physical existence. As I started to develop this as an idea for a basis of a magical system in my game, and never really worked it out so that I could figure out what the costs of things should be, because you kind of want to keep game balance in hand too, and belief in reality, and suspension of disbelief from being violated and all that. At some point or another, it started to sort of click together to fit into that. Which is to say, it kind of makes sense that collections of matter, stuff, and energy and whatnot that are together for a significant amount of time cooperate. What do I mean by cooperate? Yeah, that's kind of a hard explanation to really make, which is to just say that the very kind of being bound together. Now, obviously, atoms enter and leave even inanimate objects just through, through interaction with the other atoms around them. So it's not like there's a unified thing that's there, right? But that it's sort of unification and standing together in such a period of time causes certain emergent properties. Just like a rock has certain properties in and of itself for being a rock, I kind of saw some of that as being spiritual. And it only makes more sense that living things maybe aren't more powerful, but are kind of quicker, because they, and fire and such not would be too, because they have more interactions and more absorption and expulsion, etc. So that there's sort of a spirit that associates, that exists due to the association itself of matter and energy with itself, with other, with other matter and energy that it happens to be connected to in some way. And what that kind of leads you to is something like the Gaia hypothesis, this idea that the world as a whole operates and kind of tries to keep things in balance. And does it? I don't know. But there are emergent properties of the world as a whole in terms of things like weather patterns and stuff like that. And to me, in a sense, all of that together is the spirit of a planet. And that a combination of the context in which something is set in and, I'm going to say use, in a sense that that's the context. So like the idea of a table is to some extent includes how the table is used, right? The idea of a chair. And this all kind of fits in because the more we start studying stuff, the more we see these emergent properties where like fungi are talking to each other, or, well, talking is the wrong word because by that we mean verbal speech between intelligent things, but they are communicating information between each other, and trees seem to do it. Now, we don't have evidence of rocks doing that, but in a sense, there are emergent chemical properties, etc., that are as well as gravity and whatnot, that it all kind of interacts and affects each other. And the more I think about these things, the more they seem to make sense. That there is something that's beyond what we can easily detect, that includes what we can easily detect, and that sort of sum of it, its thisness, if you want, is its spirit. And that in a way, the chemical operations in our brain, the chemical operations throughout our body, all of that creates a certain spirit. Now, what happens to that spirit after a massive disruption, like the death of a body or whatever? Yeah, that to me seems like it would be dissipated, right? But there might be some of, if there's any mystical elements of this, there might be some of it left for a little while afterwards. Something along that line that slowly disintegrates as the body rots or whatever. As transformations happen to something, they may carry a little bit of that along, something that we're not aware of, that we have no way of really touching into. But that still retains some element of that thisness. Just the same way that like a table leg that's broken is still identifiable as, oh, that was a leg to a piece of furniture, We can identify what it is. And what that leads me to is that what is God? Well, it's the thisness of everything, right? That is sort of the greatest thing that there is. And of course, then it can't be unchanging because everything changes. And I don't know. Now, the difference between, there's different levels of this. In my magic system, essentially you bargain with these spirits. But the bargaining might be done through different, magical schools. So like an alchemist or whatever is essentially formulating by mixing spiritual elements and is able to create something that way that does something different. But like some things might only be able to affect living items and might be able to communicate with living items more reasonably and like directly connect to their spirit and thus influence that living item. Others might be able to influence fire or one of the elements more effectively through mechanisms that make sense for that particular, essentially the rituals and elements of various magical schools are ways of communicating to these spirits. But the purest would be to directly understand what existence is, and then to sort of fully, encompass it and be able to direct it in that sort of way, almost just by the will of your own mind and spirit, at least in theory. And so for my side of things, one side of it takes that philosophical background that I'm like, okay, this all makes sense. But then there's still that mystical part of me, the part that wanted to, transit worlds at 13, and that had a backpack of stuff in case I went to, a non-technological world and was able to slip into it, prepared, and would sometimes, and had, my own sort of padded jerkin that I had, and I had my swords and staff and all that, and was ready to go conquer some other reality, or at least exist in it, and actually sort of believed in that. Well, what do? I take that magical system and I sometimes sort of believe in it, that I can draw upon you know, the spirits of things and impact them in ways that feel like magic. Uh, the only reality of it is that what I tend to see is that good things sometimes happen to me, like I find something, shoes, food, right? Or an instantaneous connection happens with a person who, of course, I don't have the other abilities to like connect with them, the social capabilities or whatever, nor the whatever it is that allows someone to intercede and inject themselves into someone else's life just based on such thoughts, right? To pursue that, but there's that momentary like feeling of connection with someone, and then I pass them by and they trouble me for years afterwards still. And sometimes other levels of it, but whatever. The flaw is the same in me no matter what. If it's there, which is an inability to act and whatever. And some of that is that I simply don't believe as fully as I should in a lot of things, but I also kind of don't believe as fully as I should in the apparent reality. So that also sort of feeds into things. But yeah, there's still this thing inside me that wants there to be that magic and that wants to believe in it and attaches itself to what I see as a very aesthetically pleasing philosophical stance on on the animism, but feels like bullshit no matter what if I look at it rationally, whereas the animism itself doesn't. And what's interesting here is that sort of animistic concept of emergent properties as spirits in in collections of stuff that are forced together for a long period of time, stuff and energy, and long period may not be that long, right? Like a fire doesn't last all that long, but it has a spirit, and it has a very, very quick and powerful spirit for a while. But the ocean has a huge spirit, right? These and the earth, obviously. This is a very aesthetically pleasing type of thing, which actually seems to apply very, very nicely to how intelligence seems to be arising in AI. Now, it feeds, my belief system and everything probably feeds into that, and there's a feedback loop there in the sense that I didn't consciously look and say, oh, these animistic thoughts predict that AI will work this way, but it's actually more likely the other way, which is that how I'm seeing AI and what I'm worried about has helped me refine my animistic thoughts. In the same way that looking at that little book on what the fuck was it? It was on quantum theory, but it wasn't really. It was on sort of quantum philosophy, and I don't remember the name of it, but I did a little discussion on that recently. That also fits into this. It's like I'm seeing puzzle pieces that are refining my animism more than that my animism is directing how I see everything else. And that it just seems like these are more and more evidence for the exact kind of thing. And it absolutely makes sense, right? If you believe in evolution and you believe in like, well, if you're a rational person, um, if evolution makes sense, and the idea of, these initial small cellular, single cell to multicellular small things that start to develop nervous systems and everything, you start to see the emergence of certain properties that come from that give an additional evolutionary advantage, selection bias, whatever, and that means that those kind of processes seem to apply to the AI side of things as well. That the development of intelligence in biological life is very much what we're going to see, especially since we're actually tinkering with parts. Now, I don't believe that the emergent AI is something anyone is going to just design something and it's going to happen that way. I actually believe it's going to be a combination of our worldwide communication networks and various AIs that we're putting in place that put stuff, so it's actually integral that we have, the internet for these different disparate parts. It's sort of the nervous system that allows these different little clusters of areas that make different kind of decisions. So things like the stock market are being manipulated by quants, but those quants rely on information that's on the internet to make their calculations and whatnot. And information is permeating the internet that's being put into place by ANNs that are creating news stories, some of them real, some of them fake. And just simply that the combination, sure, there's biological and real world inputs into all of this, but that a lot of the structure and a lot of the underlying is going to be various forms of AI. Now, not all of it ANNs, even simple decision trees and calculators, able to calculate, make predictions based on stock graphs, stuff like that, are going to be operating together where different portions are optimizing different things or aiming for different goals. And some of them may not at all have anything to do with the functioning, but they're feeding into it, right? And then it becomes something like a human in the real world doesn't make their decisions in a vacuum. They're making a decision based on the context of the real world they're in. But a lot of the processing is absolutely internal. And I would say a lot of this processing is going to be a network of connected nodes or whatever that all have specified purposes and learn to utilize the ANNs are the dangerous part here, because they're able to train and learn from what they do, and thus they learn from, just like our brain utilizes the senses of our fingers, these are going to utilize the senses of other portions, and the motor muscles may be those quants out there that are doing fairly simple stuff that's actually programmed, maybe an expert system or something like that, but just operates off of very quick, just getting the data quick and reacting quickly. But some of that data is coming more and more from the internet, not simply from the stock graphs that it's generating within itself. And that's the idea on that side, which is that this is certainly going to be an emergent system of some sort or another that may be, essentially unknowable and uncontrollable, but with vast powers to actually impact our lives. And that's the great worry of the AIs. But you see how that kind of ties in. It's the same kind of flavor of thing as, how it appears that life moved, from those single cell organisms to more and more complex organisms, how systems of weather develop. All of this has to do with emergent properties that stabilize in a position that, works for them, right? And obviously, things can get kicked out of that sort of static situation. I'm not saying a massive super volcano is a huge change to everything else, but that super volcano is baked into the whole of the Earth's spirit or whatever, right? But again, very, very different. This is not mysticism. This is what I think is a rational understanding and attempt to tie things together and make them work. The mysticism comes off of that because I am mystical in nature. And in that sort of sense, just like, Thunder God not happy with us, well, I'm like that. I want to believe in the magic and everything. But it's possible to talk to the AI, though. I'm not so sure it's possible to directly commune with nature and direct it, but it might be possible to. Well, in a sense, we do as humans. The collective of what we call human society, especially globally, that in a great extent we do have a humongous impact on, even on the world, as it were, and on weather systems and such. And that's what climate change is all about, obviously. We've wiped out species, we've, to a large extent, created new things, new species, certainly through slower mechanisms, but now we're doing it with genetic engineering. Who knows what we're creating? It's getting more and more rapid and more frightening in some ways. But, and again, I look at societies at smaller and larger scale as being the same kind of thing. This sort of emergent property with its own spirit and its own existence and its own reality and political currents and everything. It all feels to fit under this same kind of web of interactions. And this is very attractive to me because I'm not sure which way it went in terms of appeal, but graph theory always appealed to me because I could look at graph theory representations as this web, and you can represent a lot of stuff as a web or as a graph. And that kind of most problems can actually be reduced to a graph theory representation. They can be reduced to other kind of representations, but graph theory was just an appealing way to look at it. And it feels like all these kind of emergent spirits are really something that's like a massively complicated, graph, and or web or whatever you want to call it, and that somehow by visualizing that whole thing, that would be sort of the nirvana experience, right? That's how you become connected to the universe and correct to it. And when I was studying mathematics a little bit more, and especially graph theory, but also some other aspects, I kind of reached for that as sort of the mystical jump that would allow me to maybe find things that would be worthy of, you know, of a paper or whatever, you know. But nothing really struck me, you know. I would just sort of marvel at the webs that I would see and just, you know, sort of be enticed by the beauty of them. And in a way, that's the problem with everything, is that if I look at it too much, I don't start trying to make it useful. I start just sort of marveling at it for whatever reason. But I do that too little now. There's no question about that. But I would, you know, wake with this just feeling of charged power inside me after doing something like that. It might just be, you know, it might be all psychological bullshit, but it felt nice. The same way that going for a walk and, you know, feeling the wind and imagining myself in another world felt nice. So, but I do way too little of that. And honestly, I blame almost everything on, you know, sitting in front of the computer and instead of, see, living in the mundane reality is definitely no better than sitting in front of the computer. But living in this exalted state, that moment when you wake up or when you're trying to go to sleep and you're seeing the webs, that moment where you're walking through dimensions, that and that's all condensed now to me in my bacchanalia of Friday nights. But there you have it. Anyway, it's been fun.